The Saturday morning started like any other weekend in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates, with the distant hum of lawn mowers and the cheerful chirping of birds creating a peaceful symphony that had become the soundtrack to life in this particular corner of middle-class America. Marcus Thompson stood in his garage, carefully organizing his extensive collection of woodworking tools that he had accumulated over 15 years of dedicated craftsmanship, each piece representing not just an instrument of creation, but a memory of projects completed, skills learned, and countless hours spent pursuing his passion for creating beautiful furniture and decorative pieces that filled his home with warmth and character. The garage itself was immaculate, with pegboards lining the walls, displaying hand tools in perfect order, a workbench that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and a dust collection system that kept the space cleaner than most people's kitchens, because Marcus took pride in maintaining his workspace with the same discipline and attention to detail that he brought to every aspect of his life. He had just finished mounting a new router table he had purchased the previous week, admiring how it fit perfectly into the workflow he had designed for his garage workshop, when he heard the aggressive rumble of a golf cart pulling into his driveway with the kind of urgency typically reserved for emergency vehicles responding to a life-threatening situation. Marcus glanced up from his work, his brow furrowing slightly as he recognized the powder blue golf cart adorned with reflective yellow stripes and a makeshift light bar that someone had clearly purchased from a novelty store, the vehicle itself serving as a rolling monument to the delusions of grandeur that seemed to afflict certain members of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association board. The cart came to an abrupt stop just inches from his garage door, and three figures emerged with the kind of self-important swagger that immediately set Marcus's teeth on edge, though his years of professional training had taught him to maintain a calm exterior regardless of the absurdity unfolding before him. The first person to approach was Gerald Hutchins, the HOA president, a portly man in his late 50s whose thinning hair was carefully combed over his spotted scalp in a style that had gone out of fashion sometime during the Reagan administration, and whose face perpetually carried the expression of someone who had just detected an unpleasant odor. Gerald wore a navy blue polo shirt with HOA President embroidered in gold letters across the breast pocket, a detail that Marcus had always found both amusing and slightly pathetic, as if the title somehow granted him authority beyond the mundane task of ensuring homeowners mowed their lawns and painted their houses in approved colors. Behind Gerald came Patricia Morrison, the vice president of the HOA board, a sharp-featured woman whose permanent scowl seemed etched into her face after what Marcus assumed must have been decades of finding fault with everyone and everything around her, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield, and her sensible shoes clicking against the concrete with military precision. The third member of this impromptu delegation was someone Marcus had never seen before. A younger man in his 30s, wearing what appeared to be a security uniform purchased from a costume shop, complete with a badge that said HOA Enforcement Officer and a utility belt laden with items that included a flashlight, a radio, and what looked suspiciously like toy handcuffs. Gerald cleared his throat with exaggerated authority, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet morning air, and pulled a folded document from the leather portfolio he carried under his arm, holding it up as if he were about to read a proclamation from the king himself. Marcus set down the wrench he had been holding and walked toward the group, maintaining a respectful distance but positioning himself directly in the threshold of his garage, a subtle territorial gesture that marked the boundary between public space and his private property. The morning sun caught the edges of his neatly trimmed beard, and his athletic build, maintained through regular workouts and the physical demands of his actual job, created an interesting contrast with the considerably less impressive physiques of his visitors. Though Marcus was far too professional to take any satisfaction from such superficial observations, Gerald began his speech without any preliminary greeting or acknowledgement of basic social courtesy, launching directly into what he clearly believed was a devastating indictment of Marcus's behavior. The HOA had received multiple complaints over the past several weeks regarding excessive noise emanating from Marcus's property, specifically from the garage workshop that he operated in violation of the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which strictly prohibited any commercial or industrial activity within residential properties. Gerald's voice took on an increasingly pompous tone as he continued, explaining that the board had conducted a thorough investigation into Marcus's activities, including surveillance of his property at various times of day, documentation of vehicles coming and going, and consultations with legal counsel regarding the appropriate enforcement actions. Patricia nodded along vigorously with every point Gerald made, occasionally interjecting affirmations like a backup singer supporting the lead vocalist, while the ersatz security officer stood with his arms crossed, attempting to look intimidating but succeeding only in appearing vaguely constipated. Marcus listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, a skill he had perfected during countless briefings and confrontations, far more serious than this suburban theater of the absurd, his face maintaining an expression of polite interest that revealed nothing of his thoughts. When Gerald finally paused to take a breath, clearly expecting Marcus to either protest vehemently or crumble under the weight of official HOA displeasure, Marcus simply raised his eyebrows slightly and asked what specifically they believed he was doing in his garage that constituted commercial or industrial activity. Gerald seemed momentarily thrown by the calm response, having apparently anticipated a more emotional reaction that would have justified the dramatic nature of their intervention, but he recovered quickly and gestured toward the interior of the garage as if the evidence were self-evident. The collection of professional-grade woodworking equipment, the organized storage systems, the dedicated workspace, all of these elements clearly indicated that Marcus was operating some form of manufacturing or contracting business from his residential property, which was absolutely forbidden under the HOA regulations. Patricia stepped forward at this point, her voice sharp and accusatory, as she added that multiple neighbors had reported seeing Marcus carrying lumber and materials into his garage at odd hours, and that the noise from his power tools often disturbed the peaceful enjoyment of their properties. She made particular note of a table saw that she claimed could be heard 3 houses away, and suggested that such equipment had no place in a residential neighborhood where families had the right to expect tranquility and compliance with community standards. The security officer, whose name tag identified him as Officer Daniels, despite the fact that he possessed no actual law enforcement credentials, chimed in to assert that he had personally observed Marcus's activities on multiple occasions and could testify to the ongoing violations. Marcus noted with some amusement that Daniels kept one hand resting on his radio as if he might need to call for backup at any moment, though backup from whom remained unclear, given that the HOA's jurisdiction extended only to sending strongly worded letters and imposing fines. Gerald returned to his dominant position in the conversation, announcing that the HOA board had met in emergency session the previous evening and voted unanimously to take immediate enforcement action regarding Marcus's workshop. The board had authorized the confiscation of any equipment deemed to be commercial or industrial in nature, pending a formal hearing to determine the appropriate fines and remediation measures. Gerald explained this decision with the air of a judge pronouncing sentence, clearly believing that he was exercising legitimate authority rather than engaging in what any reasonable person would recognize as an absurd overreach of power. He then produced another document, this one labeled as a Notice of Equipment Seizure, which listed approximately $15,000 worth of Marcus's personal property that the HOA claimed the right to remove from his premises. The list included his table saw, bandsaw, planer, jointer, drill press, and various other tools that Marcus had accumulated over years of dedicated pursuit of his hobby, each item meticulously documented with estimated values that Gerald must have researched online. Marcus took the document from Gerald's outstretched hand and scanned it briefly, his expression still revealing nothing of the mixture of disbelief and irritation building inside him. He noted that the seizure notice claimed authority under several sections of the HOA covenants, none of which actually appeared to grant the organization any right to confiscate personal property, and all of which seemed to represent creative interpretations of language that was clearly intended to address entirely different issues. The document also referenced something called the Willow Creek Estates Community Enforcement Protocol, which Marcus was certain had never been approved by a vote of the homeowners, and probably existed only in Gerald's imagination, or perhaps in some binder of invented regulations that the board kept in their office. Patricia was already moving toward the garage with purpose, her clipboard at the ready, as if she intended to begin cataloging items for removal, while Officer Daniels unclipped his radio and spoke into it with theatrical importance, presumably alerting someone somewhere that the enforcement action was underway. It was at this moment that Marcus decided he had allowed the farce to continue long enough, and that it was time to introduce a dose of reality into Gerald's carefully constructed fantasy world. He held up one hand in a gesture that was both polite and unmistakably authoritative, the kind of motion that carried weight beyond its physical simplicity, and informed the group that they needed to stop immediately and listen very carefully to what he was about to tell them. Gerald's face flushed with indignation at being interrupted in what he clearly considered his moment of triumph, and he began to sputter something about Marcus having no right to interfere with official HOA business. But Marcus's steady gaze and the sudden shift in his demeanor caused Gerald to trail off mid-sentence. Patricia froze in her tracks, sensing that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of the situation, while Officer Daniels's hand moved uncertainly toward his belt, though what he intended to do remained unclear. Marcus reached into his back pocket and withdrew his wallet with deliberate slowness, the leather worn but well-maintained, and flipped it open to reveal the badge and identification card that he carried with him at all times as required by his position. The morning sun glinted off the gold badge, and the words "United States Marshal" appeared in clear lettering above his official credentials, accompanied by his photograph and the seal of the Department of Justice. He held the identification at eye level for several seconds, allowing each member of the HOA delegation to fully comprehend what they were seeing, watching as the color drained from Gerald's face and Patricia's mouth fell open in an almost comical expression of shock. Officer Daniels took an involuntary step backward, his hand dropping away from his utility belt, as if the toy handcuffs had suddenly become radioactive, and his eyes darting between Marcus's badge and his face with growing alarm. Marcus explained in a calm, measured voice that his woodworking hobby was exactly that. A personal hobby pursued on his own time, with his own equipment on his own property, and that he had never engaged in any commercial activity from his residence. The tools in his garage represented a personal investment in a craft that he had practiced since his teenage years, long before he had joined federal law enforcement, and every piece of equipment had been purchased with his own money for his own use. He detailed how he had specifically designed his workshop to minimize noise, installing sound-dampening insulation in the garage walls and ceiling, placing rubber mats under every major piece of equipment to reduce vibration, and limiting his use of loud tools to reasonable hours that fell well within the community's noise ordinances. Marcus also pointed out that he had reviewed the HOA covenants thoroughly before purchasing his home 3 years ago, and that nothing in those documents prohibited residents from having personal workshops or pursuing hobbies that involved the use of tools, provided such activities did not create genuine nuisances or violate local laws. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a harder edge that caused Gerald to shrink visibly, the attempt to confiscate his personal property represented not only a gross overreach of HOA authority, but potentially several criminal offenses, including attempted theft and conspiracy to commit theft. As a federal law enforcement officer with extensive experience in investigating property crimes, Marcus was intimately familiar with the relevant statutes, and he could assure the HOA delegation that their planned actions would have resulted in serious legal consequences for everyone involved. He suggested that they might want to consult with actual legal counsel, rather than relying on whatever amateur interpretation of the law had led them to believe they possessed the authority to seize a homeowner's personal belongings. Patricia had begun backing toward the golf cart, her clipboard clutched against her chest defensively, while Officer Daniels appeared to be seriously contemplating whether he could simply fade into the background and pretend he had never been part of this confrontation. Gerald attempted to rally, clearing his throat and insisting that the HOA had every right to enforce its covenants, and that Marcus's position as a federal officer did not exempt him from community rules, but the words came out with far less confidence than his earlier pronouncements, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the seizure notice. Marcus allowed a thin smile to cross his face, not a friendly expression, but rather the kind of smile that indicated he was rapidly running out of patience with the situation. He informed Gerald that he was absolutely correct, that his federal position did not grant him any special exemptions from legitimate HOA regulations, but that the HOA's regulations did not actually prohibit what he was doing, and that their attempt to fabricate violations and seize property based on those fabricated violations was what lawyers typically referred to as actionable misconduct. Marcus suggested that if the HOA board wanted to continue down this path, he would be happy to file formal complaints with both local law enforcement and the state attorney general's office, and he could also direct them to several attorneys who specialized in HOA abuse cases and would likely be very interested in taking on a suit against the Willow Creek Estates board. The mention of attorneys and formal complaints seemed to penetrate Gerald's self-important bubble in a way that mere logic and reason had not, and he began stammering something about misunderstandings and the need for clearer communication between the board and residents. Patricia had already made it back to the golf cart and appeared to be urgently suggesting that they leave immediately, her earlier enthusiasm for enforcement action having evaporated like morning dew under the harsh sun of reality. Officer Daniels was studiously examining his shoes as if they had suddenly become the most fascinating objects in the world, clearly hoping that if he remained very quiet and still, everyone might forget he had been part of this debacle. Marcus crossed his arms and waited, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably as the HOA delegation came to terms with the fact that their attempted power play had not only failed, but had potentially exposed them to serious legal liability. Gerald folded the seizure notice with shaking hands and mumbled something about the board needing to review the matter further before taking any enforcement action. His earlier bombast replaced by the nervous energy of someone who had just realized they had made a terrible mistake. He suggested that perhaps there had been some confusion regarding the complaints they had received, and that possibly the board had acted too hastily in authorizing the equipment seizure without fully investigating the situation. Marcus remained silent, his expression making it clear that he considered this transparent backpedaling to be too little and far too late, and that Gerald's attempt to reframe their aggressive enforcement action as a simple misunderstanding was not going to make the problem disappear. Patricia had started the golf cart's motor, the electric whir sounding unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere, and was clearly ready to execute a tactical retreat at the earliest possible moment. It was at this point that Marcus decided to push a bit further, sensing that there was more to this situation than simply an overzealous HOA board. He asked Gerald directly who had filed the complaints about his workshop, requesting specific names and dates so that he could address any legitimate concerns his neighbors might have about noise or disruption. Gerald hesitated, his eyes darting to Patricia as if seeking support or guidance, and mumbled something vague about multiple anonymous complaints that the board was obligated to investigate. Marcus's expression hardened at the mention of anonymous complaints, a red flag that suggested the entire enforcement action might have been initiated based on fabricated grievances rather than actual neighborhood concerns. He pointed out that anonymous complaints were generally not considered sufficient grounds for serious enforcement actions in any legitimate organization, and that homeowners had the right to face their accusers and respond to specific allegations rather than vague generalities. Gerald's discomfort increased visibly as Marcus pressed the issue, and he began insisting that the board had to protect the confidentiality of residents who came forward with concerns, that revealing names might subject those individuals to retaliation or harassment, and that the board's obligation was to the community as a whole, rather than to any individual homeowner. Marcus countered that, while protecting legitimate whistleblowers was certainly important, the refusal to provide any specifics about the alleged violations suggested that the complaints might not actually exist, or that they were so weak that they would not withstand scrutiny if subjected to any kind of objective review. He noted that in his professional experience, people who claimed to be acting on anonymous tips were often simply advancing their own agendas, while hiding behind the pretense of responding to community concerns, and he wondered aloud whether that might be the case here. Patricia called out from the golf cart that they really needed to leave, that the board had other matters to attend to that morning, and that this discussion could be continued at a more appropriate time and place. Gerald seized on this escape route with obvious relief, agreeing enthusiastically that yes, they should schedule a formal meeting to discuss the situation in a more structured environment, and that perhaps cooler heads would prevail once everyone had a chance to review the relevant documents and regulations. Marcus watched with thinly veiled skepticism as Gerald backed toward the cart, still clutching his leather portfolio and making vague promises about follow-up communications and further review. Officer Daniels had already claimed the rear-facing seat of the golf cart and appeared to be trying to make himself as small and inconspicuous as possible, his earlier tough guy persona completely abandoned in favor of making himself invisible. As the golf cart began its retreat down the driveway, Marcus called out one final observation that caused Gerald to flinch visibly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He mentioned that he found it curious how the HOA board seemed to have significant resources to spend on enforcement officers and surveillance of homeowners, but complained constantly about insufficient funds for basic maintenance and improvements that residents actually wanted. He suggested that perhaps a thorough audit of the HOA's finances might be warranted, especially given some of the questionable expenditures he had noticed in the budget documents that the board was required to make available to homeowners. Gerald's face went from pale to bright red in the span of seconds, and he accelerated the golf cart with enough force that Patricia had to grab the support bar to avoid being thrown sideways, the vehicle lurching down the street in what could only be described as a panicked flight. Marcus stood in his driveway and watched the powder blue golf cart disappear around the corner, its yellow stripes flashing in the sunlight like a beacon of bureaucratic absurdity. He shook his head slowly, reflecting on the strange reality that he dealt with violent criminals and dangerous fugitives as part of his regular work, yet somehow found himself having to flash his badge at an HOA president who thought he had the authority to confiscate private property. The entire confrontation would have been comical if it had not revealed something potentially more troubling, a pattern of behavior that suggested the Willow Creek Estates HOA board might be operating well outside the bounds of legitimate authority and possibly engaging in activities that warranted closer examination. Marcus had seen enough corruption investigations during his career to recognize the warning signs: the aggressive overreach, the refusal to provide documentation, the defensive reactions when questioned about finances, and the attempt to intimidate a homeowner into compliance through threats of property seizure. He returned to his garage and looked around at his carefully organized workshop, the tools that represented years of collecting and refinement, the projects in various stages of completion that lined the back wall, and the peaceful refuge that woodworking provided from the intensity of his professional life. Marcus had purchased this home specifically because it had a spacious garage that could accommodate his hobby, and he had invested considerable time and money into making the space both functional and compliant with all relevant regulations. The idea that some petty bureaucrat with an inflated sense of authority could threaten to take it all away based on fabricated complaints and invented regulations filled him with a cold anger that he knew he needed to channel productively. This was not over, not by a long shot, and Marcus suspected that his casual mention of a financial audit had struck a nerve that would lead to interesting discoveries. Over the next several hours, Marcus found his mind returning repeatedly to the morning's confrontation as he worked on a jewelry box he was building for his sister's birthday. The precision required for the delicate joinery normally helped him achieve a meditative state that cleared his thoughts, but today he could not quite shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something significant. Gerald's reaction to the mention of an audit had been too extreme, too visceral, to be explained by simple embarrassment at having his authority challenged. Patricia's eagerness to leave the scene suggested that she too had something to hide, and the very existence of Officer Daniels raised questions about how the HOA was spending its money and what they thought they were accomplishing with their fake security force. Marcus decided that he would spend some time that evening reviewing the HOA's public documents, the budget reports, meeting minutes, and financial disclosures that homeowners were entitled to examine, looking for the patterns and discrepancies that his training had taught him to identify. As the afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, casting long shadows across his workbench, Marcus completed the final fitting on the jewelry box and stepped back to admire his work. The joints were tight and clean, the wood grain perfectly matched, and the piece would serve his sister well for decades to come. He found satisfaction in creating things of lasting value, in exercising skills that had nothing to do with his professional identity, and in the simple pleasure of transforming raw materials into beautiful finished products through patience and attention to detail. This garage workshop was his sanctuary, his creative outlet, and his connection to a simpler form of accomplishment that did not involve guns or badges or the dark complexities of federal law enforcement. No collection of small-minded bureaucrats with delusions of authority was going to take that away from him, and if they tried again, they would discover that Marcus Thompson was far better equipped to fight institutional corruption than they had ever imagined. The sound of a text message alert drew Marcus's attention to his phone, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from David Chen, his neighbor from 3 doors down and one of the few residents in Willow Creek Estates with whom Marcus had developed a genuine friendship. David's message was brief but intriguing, asking if Marcus had encountered any problems with the HOA that day and suggesting they should talk. Marcus wiped the sawdust from his hands and replied that he had indeed had an interesting morning and would be happy to compare notes. Within minutes, his phone rang, and David's voice came through with unusual urgency, explaining that he had witnessed the golf cart delegation's visit to Marcus's house and had some information that Marcus would definitely want to hear. David suggested meeting at the neighborhood park in 30 minutes, somewhere they could talk privately away from potential surveillance or eavesdropping, a suggestion that struck Marcus as perhaps overly dramatic but also consistent with what he was beginning to suspect about the HOA board's activities. Marcus cleaned up his workspace with practiced efficiency, putting away tools and sweeping up sawdust, his mind already shifting into the analytical mode that his work demanded. If David had information about the HOA that required a private meeting in the park, then the situation was likely more complex than a simple case of board members drunk on their tiny amount of power. Marcus had learned long ago to trust his instincts when something felt wrong, and everything about the morning's confrontation had felt wrong, from the prepared seizure list to the fake security officer, to Gerald's extreme reaction at the mention of an audit. He locked the garage behind him and headed into the house to change into casual clothes more suitable for a walk in the park, his law enforcement training already compiling a mental list of questions and angles to explore. Whatever David had to tell him, Marcus suspected it would confirm his growing belief that the Willow Creek Estates HOA board was engaged in something far more serious than simply being overzealous about enforcing petty regulations. The neighborhood park was only a short walk from Marcus's house, a pleasant green space with walking trails, playground equipment, and scattered benches under mature trees that provided welcome shade on warm afternoons. As Marcus approached their agreed meeting spot near the small pond at the park center, he saw David already waiting, pacing nervously and glancing around as if checking for observers. David was a software engineer who worked from home, a quiet man in his early 40s whose analytical mind and attention to detail had made him successful in his field, and had also apparently led him to notice things about the HOA that others might have missed. When David spotted Marcus approaching, he waved and walked quickly toward him, his expression a mixture of relief and anxiety that suggested whatever he had to share weighed heavily on him. David wasted no time on preliminaries once they were both seated on a bench overlooking the pond, launching directly into an explanation of what he had discovered over the past few months. He had been reviewing the HOA's financial documents as part of a personal project to analyze how their assessment fees were being spent, expecting to find simple mismanagement or waste, but instead uncovering what appeared to be systematic theft. David pulled out a tablet computer and called up a spreadsheet that he had painstakingly assembled, comparing the HOA's reported expenses against actual work that had been completed and services that had been provided. The numbers told a troubling story of inflated invoices, phantom contractors, and payments for work that had never been performed, all adding up to what David estimated was somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 that had disappeared from the HOA's accounts over the past 2 years. His voice shook slightly as he walked Marcus through the evidence, explaining that he had been trying to decide what to do with this information when he saw the HOA board's aggressive move against Marcus's workshop and realized they might be willing to do far worse things to protect their scheme. Marcus listened carefully to David's presentation, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the patterns of embezzlement and fraud that the spreadsheet revealed. This was not simply careless bookkeeping or innocent mistakes, but rather a carefully constructed system designed to siphon money from the HOA while maintaining plausible deniability through layers of fake documentation and shell companies. David explained that he had tracked multiple payments to a company called Willow Creek Property Services, which allegedly provided landscaping and maintenance work, but which did not appear in any business registry and had no online presence beyond a basic website that looked like it had been thrown together in an afternoon. When David had tried to verify the work that this company supposedly performed, he had found that many of the invoices described projects that had never happened or maintenance that had never been done, yet the HOA had been paying them thousands of dollars per month for over 18 months. Patricia Morrison's signature appeared on most of these payment authorizations, with Gerald Hutchins signing off on the larger invoices, creating a paper trail that implicated both of them directly in the fraud. The implications of David's findings hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because the corruption itself was shocking, but because it explained so much about the HOA board's behavior and their apparent desperation to maintain control. If Gerald and Patricia were stealing tens of thousands of dollars from the homeowners, then they would be highly motivated to discourage any scrutiny of their activities, to intimidate potential whistleblowers, and to create distractions that would keep residents focused on petty disputes rather than serious financial irregularities. Marcus's casual mention of an audit that morning must have terrified them, confirming their fear that someone was beginning to look closely at their operations and threatening to expose the entire scheme. The attempted seizure of Marcus's tools now appeared in a different light, not as simple bureaucratic overreach, but as part of a pattern of aggressive intimidation designed to establish the board's dominance and discourage homeowners from questioning their authority. David admitted that he had been paralyzed by uncertainty about how to proceed with his discovery, worried that confronting the board directly would lead to retaliation and concerned that reporting them to authorities might not be taken seriously, since HOA disputes were generally considered civil matters rather than criminal cases. He had been documenting everything meticulously, building a comprehensive case file, but had not yet taken any action to expose the fraud, because he was unsure who he could trust within the community and fearful of becoming a target himself. Seeing the board's attempt to confiscate Marcus's property that morning had crystallized his resolve, making him realize that silence was no longer an acceptable option and that the corruption needed to be addressed before it escalated further or before more homeowners became victims of the board's intimidation tactics. Marcus reassured David that his concerns about retaliation were valid, but that the evidence he had compiled was exactly the kind of documentation needed to build a serious case against the HOA board. As a federal officer, Marcus had contacts with local law enforcement and state regulatory agencies who would definitely be interested in this kind of systematic fraud, and the amounts of money involved were sufficient to trigger criminal rather than merely civil penalties. He suggested that they begin by consulting with an attorney who specialized in HOA law to ensure they understood all the relevant regulations and protections, and then approach law enforcement through proper channels to initiate a formal investigation. Marcus also recommended that David immediately secure multiple backup copies of his evidence and consider placing them with trusted third parties, because if the board discovered what he knew, they might attempt to destroy records or create additional complications. The two men sat on the park bench as the afternoon shadows lengthened, discussing strategy and planning their next moves with the careful deliberation of people who understood they were confronting something serious and potentially dangerous. Marcus found himself energized by the challenge, despite the frustration of having his peaceful hobby interrupted by criminal investigation of a different sort than his usual work. David seemed relieved to finally have an ally who understood the gravity of what he had discovered and who had both the expertise and the courage to help him expose the corruption. They agreed to meet again soon to coordinate their efforts and begin reaching out to other homeowners who might have noticed irregularities or who might have been targets of the board's intimidation tactics. As they parted ways and headed back toward their respective homes, Marcus felt the familiar focus settling over him that always came when he was pursuing justice, and he knew that the Willow Creek Estates HOA board was about to discover that they had picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. The confrontation in his driveway that morning had been just the opening move in what promised to be a much longer and more consequential game, and Marcus intended to make sure that when it was over, the corrupted board members would face the full weight of the legal consequences they had earned through their greed and abuse of power. The following Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem sharper and more focused, as if the universe itself was preparing for the confrontation that Marcus knew was inevitable now that he had committed to exposing the HOA board's corruption. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and several folders of printed documents spread across the surface, having spent most of Sunday evening and early Monday morning reviewing the evidence that David had compiled, along with the HOA's official records that were supposedly available to all homeowners, but which Marcus suspected very few residents ever bothered to examine in detail. The financial discrepancies were even more obvious when viewed through the lens of someone trained to identify patterns of fraud and embezzlement, and Marcus found himself simultaneously impressed by David's thoroughness and appalled by the brazenness of Gerald and Patricia's scheme, which relied more on the apathy and trust of homeowners than on any particularly sophisticated methods of concealment. Marcus had already reached out to Sandra Williams, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and had built a reputation for taking on corrupt boards throughout the state, explaining the situation in broad terms and arranging a meeting for later that week to discuss potential legal strategies. Sandra had sounded intrigued by the case during their brief phone conversation, mentioning that she had heard rumors about problems with the Willow Creek Estates board, but had never had a client willing to challenge them directly, and she expressed particular interest in the documentation that David had assembled regarding the phantom contractor payments. Marcus had also contacted Detective Ray Martinez at the local police department, an old friend from his days working joint task force operations, and arranged an informal lunch meeting to discuss whether the evidence warranted opening a criminal investigation or whether it would be better handled through civil litigation and regulatory complaints. The sound of his doorbell interrupted Marcus's review of a particularly suspicious invoice from Willow Creek Property Services that claimed to have performed extensive irrigation repairs that multiple neighbors confirmed had never actually occurred. The kind of phantom work that represented the core of the board's fraudulent scheme. Marcus closed his laptop and walked to the front door, glancing through the peephole to see a nervous-looking woman in her mid-30s whom he recognized as Jennifer Kowalski, a resident who lived on the next street over, and whom Marcus had met occasionally at neighborhood gatherings, but with whom he had never had any substantial conversations. He opened the door and offered a polite greeting, noting the way Jennifer's eyes darted around as if checking to see whether anyone was watching her visit, behavior that immediately suggested she had information to share, but was concerned about being observed by the wrong people. Jennifer apologized for the unexpected visit and explained in a rush of words that she had heard through the neighborhood grapevine about Marcus's confrontation with the HOA board on Saturday, and that she needed to talk to someone about problems she had been having with Gerald and Patricia that were making her feel increasingly uncomfortable and even slightly frightened. Marcus invited her inside and offered coffee, which she accepted gratefully, and they settled into his living room where Jennifer could sit with her back to the windows, a positioning choice that Marcus noted as consistent with someone who was genuinely worried about surveillance or observation. She clutched her coffee mug with both hands, as if drawing warmth from it, despite the moderate temperature, and took a deep breath before launching into a story that added another disturbing dimension to the picture of HOA corruption that was beginning to emerge. Jennifer explained that 6 months ago she had questioned an assessment for special fees that the HOA board had levied against all homeowners for what they claimed were emergency repairs to the neighborhood's entrance monuments and signage. Repairs that Jennifer could see from the street had not been particularly extensive or expensive yet, which were costing each household nearly $800. She had attended an HOA board meeting to ask for a detailed breakdown of the costs and to request documentation of the contractor's bids and invoices, reasonable questions that any homeowner had the right to ask about significant expenditures of their money. Gerald had responded to her inquiries with dismissive hostility, insisting that the board was not required to justify every expenditure to individual homeowners, and suggesting that Jennifer's questions demonstrated a lack of trust in the elected leadership that was insulting and inappropriate. Patricia had been even more aggressive, accusing Jennifer of trying to undermine the board's authority, and threatening to file harassment complaints if Jennifer continued to cause disruptions at meetings. The situation had escalated from there in ways that Jennifer found increasingly menacing and difficult to explain as simple coincidence or misunderstanding. Within 2 weeks of her questions at the board meeting, Jennifer received a violation notice claiming that her fence was 6 inches too tall, according to HOA regulations, despite the fact that the fence had been professionally installed by the previous homeowner years before Jennifer purchased the property and had never been cited as problematic before. When Jennifer pointed out that multiple other homes in the neighborhood had fences of identical height, she was told that enforcement was complaint-driven and that if she wanted to file complaints about other properties, she was welcome to do so, but that her fence needed to be modified or she would face fines. Then came a citation for her mailbox being the wrong shade of black, followed by complaints about her trash cans being visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup, and then a notice that her landscaping was not being maintained to community standards, even though Jennifer employed the same lawn service used by half the neighborhood. Jennifer's voice shook as she described the feeling of being constantly watched and scrutinized, of living under a microscope where every tiny aspect of her property was subject to official complaint and potential fines, while her neighbors who had not questioned the board's authority seemed to face no such intensive enforcement of regulations. She had stopped attending board meetings because the hostile environment made her feel physically sick, and she had even considered selling her home and moving elsewhere just to escape the constant pressure and harassment. The final straw had come 3 weeks ago when she returned home from work to find Officer Daniels parked in front of her house in the HOA golf cart, sitting there for over an hour without any apparent purpose other than to intimidate her, an act that felt like psychological warfare, designed to make her afraid in her own home. Jennifer had documented all of the violations and citations she had received, keeping meticulous records in case she needed to defend herself or prove that she was being unfairly targeted, and she pulled a thick folder from her bag to show Marcus the extent of the campaign against her. Marcus examined Jennifer's documentation with growing anger, recognizing the pattern of targeted harassment that often accompanied corruption schemes when someone asked uncomfortable questions or threatened to expose wrongdoing. The violations cited against Jennifer were petty, and many of them appeared to be fabricated or based on selective enforcement of rules that were routinely ignored when applied to other homeowners, classic tactics used to punish whistleblowers and discourage others from speaking up. He asked Jennifer whether she had reported the harassment to any authorities or sought legal advice, and she explained that she had consulted with an attorney who told her that HOA disputes were notoriously difficult to litigate, that judges often deferred to board authority unless there was clear evidence of illegal activity, and that the costs of fighting the board through the courts could easily exceed tens of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of success. The attorney had advised her to either comply with the violations, sell her home, or try to organize other homeowners to vote out the current board at the next election, none of which struck Jennifer as satisfactory solutions to what she considered criminal harassment. Marcus shared with Jennifer the basic outline of what David had discovered regarding the financial fraud, being careful not to reveal details that might compromise the investigation, but providing enough information to help Jennifer understand that her harassment was likely part of a broader pattern of the board protecting their corrupt activities. He explained that he and David were working with legal counsel and law enforcement contacts to build a case against the board, and that Jennifer's documentation of targeted enforcement would be valuable evidence of the board's willingness to abuse their authority, to silence critics. Marcus could see the relief wash over Jennifer's face as she realized she was not alone in recognizing the problems with the HOA leadership, and that someone with actual law enforcement expertise was taking the situation seriously enough to pursue formal action against Gerald and Patricia. Jennifer revealed another piece of information that Marcus found particularly interesting, mentioning that she had become friendly with Carol Anderson, who worked as the part-time administrative assistant for the HOA, and handled much of the paperwork and record-keeping for the board. Carol had made several cryptic comments to Jennifer over the past few months that suggested she was uncomfortable with some of the things she was being asked to do, including processing invoices that seemed questionable and maintaining 2 different sets of files for certain contractors and expenses. Jennifer had not pressed Carol for details at the time because she did not want to put the woman in an awkward position, but now that Marcus was conducting an investigation, Jennifer thought that Carol might be willing to provide information if approached correctly by someone who could offer her protection from retaliation. Marcus made a mental note to have his attorney reach out to Carol through proper legal channels, as an administrative assistant who handled the actual paperwork could potentially provide crucial evidence and testimony about the mechanics of the fraud scheme. Over the next hour, Marcus and Jennifer discussed strategy and coordinated their efforts, with Marcus advising her to continue documenting any harassment or violations she received, but to avoid directly confronting the board until they had built a strong enough case to take decisive action. He also suggested that Jennifer discreetly reach out to other homeowners whom she trusted to see whether anyone else had experienced similar patterns of harassment after questioning board decisions, as building a larger coalition of affected residents would strengthen their position both legally and politically. Jennifer left Marcus's house looking more hopeful than she had in months, armed with the knowledge that she was not paranoid or oversensitive, but had legitimately been targeted by corrupt officials, and that help was finally coming, in the form of people who had the expertise and determination to hold the board accountable. After Jennifer departed, Marcus spent some time updating the case file he was building, adding her documentation to the growing collection of evidence and noting the patterns of behavior that were emerging from multiple sources. The picture that was forming showed an HOA board that had moved far beyond simple financial fraud into a systematic pattern of abuse of authority, using their power to enrich themselves through embezzlement, while silencing anyone who asked uncomfortable questions through targeted harassment and intimidation. Marcus had dealt with organized crime figures who operated with less brazenness than Gerald and Patricia, though admittedly the stakes were much lower in an HOA context, and the perpetrators probably did not see themselves as real criminals, but rather as people who were simply taking what they deserved for their service to the community, a rationalization that Marcus had heard countless times from white-collar criminals who believed their crimes were somehow less serious than street crimes. The next several days passed in a flurry of activity as Marcus worked both his regular federal cases and the HOA investigation simultaneously, finding that the mental shift between pursuing violent fugitives and corrupt suburbanites required a certain flexibility, but ultimately drew on similar skills of evidence gathering, witness interviews, and strategic planning. He met with Sandra Williams at her law office on Wednesday afternoon, spreading out all the documentation that David and Jennifer had provided, along with Marcus's own analysis of the HOA's financial records and enforcement patterns. Sandra spent over 2 hours reviewing the materials with the focused intensity of someone who had found exactly the kind of case she most enjoyed prosecuting, making notes and asking detailed questions about specific transactions and incidents that might be particularly valuable for building both criminal and civil cases against the board members. Sandra explained that the evidence supported multiple potential legal actions, including criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, civil racketeering claims under state law, and regulatory complaints with the state's HOA Oversight Board that could result in the removal of the current leadership and the appointment of a receiver to manage the association's affairs. She recommended a multi-pronged approach that would involve simultaneously pursuing criminal charges through law enforcement, filing civil suits to recover the stolen money and obtain damages for the harassed homeowners, and working with state regulators to ensure that new board members were elected and proper financial controls were implemented to prevent future corruption. Sandra also suggested organizing a coalition of affected homeowners who could present a united front at the next board meeting and demand accountability, creating public pressure that would make it harder for Gerald and Patricia to dismiss the allegations or continue their intimidation tactics. Marcus met with Detective Ray Martinez on Thursday, over lunch, at a quiet restaurant where they could talk privately without attracting attention, sliding a flash drive across the table that contained copies of all the evidence he and David had compiled. Ray was a seasoned investigator who specialized in financial crimes and had worked with Marcus on several cases over the years where federal and local jurisdictions overlapped, and he had the kind of skeptical, analytical mind that made him excellent at unraveling complex fraud schemes. Ray reviewed the high-level summary that Marcus had prepared while they ate, his eyebrows rising higher with each page as he absorbed the scope of the corruption and the brazenness of the scheme. When he finished reading, Ray sat back and let out a low whistle, remarking that he had seen corporate executives go to prison for less systematic fraud than what the HOA board appeared to have committed, and that the evidence Marcus had compiled would easily justify opening a formal investigation. Ray explained that the local police department had limited resources for investigating HOA fraud cases since they were generally considered lower priority than violent crimes or drug trafficking, but that the amount of money involved and the evidence of a systematic scheme rather than isolated incidents of mismanagement would warrant allocating investigative resources to the case. He suggested that they might want to bring in the state attorney general's office as well, since that office had a white-collar crime unit that specialized in exactly these kinds of corruption cases, and had recently been making a priority of cracking down on HOA fraud following several high-profile cases around the Patacros state. Ray promised to review all the evidence in detail and discuss it with his lieutenant and the district attorney's office to determine the best approach for moving forward with criminal charges, and he cautioned Marcus that while the evidence was strong, building a prosecutable case would take time and would require cooperation from witnesses who might be reluctant to testify for fear of retaliation. Marcus returned home that evening, feeling satisfied with the progress they were making, but also aware that the real confrontation with the HOA board was still to come, and that Gerald and Patricia would likely escalate their efforts to protect themselves once they realized they were under serious investigation. He found a certified letter in his mailbox from the HOA's attorney, a development that did not surprise him given how the board typically operated when faced with challenges to their authority. The letter was full of legal boilerplate and threatening language, claiming that Marcus had violated multiple HOA covenants through his operation of an illegal commercial workshop, and that failure to immediately cease all such activities and pay the assessed fines would result in legal action, including potential foreclosure on his property. Marcus read the letter with detached amusement, noting that it contained no specific evidence of any actual violations and relied entirely on vague assertions and references to board authority that likely had no legal foundation. He forwarded a copy of the letter to Sandra Williams with a note suggesting that they might want to file a preemptive lawsuit against the board for harassment and abuse of process, establishing in court that Marcus's workshop was a legitimate personal hobby and that the board's attempts to prohibit it were beyond their authority. Sandra responded within an hour with enthusiastic agreement, explaining that filing their own lawsuit would shift the dynamics of the situation by putting the board on the defensive and forcing them to justify their actions in a public forum where their corruption might be exposed. She suggested they could combine Marcus's individual case with Jennifer's harassment claims and David's financial fraud allegations into a comprehensive lawsuit that would address all aspects of the board's misconduct, creating a single legal action that would be more efficient and more impactful than multiple separate cases. Over the weekend, Marcus organized a discreet meeting at his house with a small group of homeowners who had been identified as potentially sympathetic to challenging the board, including David, Jennifer, and 3 other residents who had experienced various forms of harassment or who had questions about the HOA's financial management. Marcus was careful to limit the size of the initial group to avoid attracting attention or alerting the board to their organizing efforts, and he made sure that everyone understood the need for discretion until they were ready to go public with their allegations. The group spent several hours sharing their experiences and reviewing the evidence, with each person contributing pieces of information that helped fill in the larger picture of how the board operated and where their vulnerabilities might lie. Tom Bradford, a retired accountant who had moved to the neighborhood 3 years ago, provided particularly valuable insights into the financial fraud scheme after reviewing David's spreadsheets and the HOA's official records. Tom explained that the pattern of payments to Willow Creek Property Services matched classic embezzlement tactics he had seen during his career, with the amounts carefully kept below thresholds that might trigger automatic audits or extra scrutiny, and the timing of invoices structured to coincide with periods when homeowners were likely to be distracted by holidays or other events. Tom also identified several other suspicious vendors in the HOA's records who appeared to exist only on paper, receiving regular payments for services that no one could recall seeing performed, suggesting that the fraud was even more extensive than David had initially calculated. Tom estimated that the total amount stolen over the past 3 years could easily exceed $100,000, a figure that made everyone in the room react with shock and anger. Maria Santos, a single mother who worked as a nurse and had lived in the neighborhood for 5 years, shared her experience of being fined repeatedly for minor violations after she had complained at a board meeting about the poor condition of the neighborhood playground equipment that her children used regularly. Maria had been told that there was no money in the budget for playground improvements, despite the substantial assessment fees that every homeowner paid quarterly, a claim that now appeared obviously false, given the evidence of money being siphoned off through fraudulent invoices. Maria's willingness to speak publicly about her harassment was particularly valuable because her sympathetic profile as a hardworking single mother would make it difficult for the board to paint her as a troublemaker or malcontent, and her concerns about playground safety would resonate with many families in the neighborhood. The group discussed various strategies for moving forward, including whether to confront the board directly at the next scheduled meeting or to wait until after the criminal investigation was underway, and they had stronger legal protections against retaliation. Marcus advocated for a measured approach that involved continuing to gather evidence and coordinate with law enforcement and legal counsel while beginning to quietly organize other homeowners who might support their efforts, building strength in numbers before making any public accusations that would give the board time to destroy evidence or construct defenses. Others argued for more immediate action, wanting to expose the corruption quickly and prevent any additional money from being stolen while the investigation slowly developed. Eventually, the group reached a compromise position where they would attend the next board meeting as a unified group and begin asking pointed questions about financial transparency and contractor relationships, testing the board's responses, and potentially provoking reactions that would reveal their consciousness of guilt. Sandra Williams joined the group via video call toward the end of the meeting to provide legal guidance and discuss the timeline for filing their lawsuit against the board, explaining that she was drafting comprehensive complaints that would address Marcus's harassment regarding his workshop, Jennifer and Maria's targeting through selective enforcement, and David's allegations of financial fraud. Sandra estimated that they could file the suits within 2 weeks, and she recommended that they coordinate the filing with Detective Martinez's criminal investigation so that both the civil and criminal cases would become public simultaneously, maximizing pressure on the board and making it harder for them to mount an effective defense on multiple fronts. She also advised the group about their rights as homeowners to access HOA records and attend board meetings, emphasizing that while the board might try to intimidate them or limit their participation, there were specific laws protecting homeowner access to information and involvement in association governance. After the meeting concluded and the other homeowners had departed, Marcus sat alone in his living room and reflected on how quickly a simple Saturday morning confrontation about his workshop had evolved into a full-scale investigation of systematic corruption and abuse of power. He thought about the irony that he spent his professional life pursuing dangerous criminals across state lines, dealing with armed fugitives and complex interstate investigations, yet found himself now focused on bringing down an HOA president whose crimes involved fake invoices and harassment of neighbors rather than violence or drugs. But Marcus understood that corruption was corruption regardless of the context, and that people who abused positions of trust to enrich themselves at the expense of others deserved to be held accountable, whether they were running a drug cartel or a suburban homeowners association, because the principles of justice and the rule of law had to apply universally, or they meant nothing at all. The following Monday brought a development that Marcus had been anticipating, with Officer Daniels appearing at his door mid-morning bearing another official-looking notice from the HOA board, this one claiming that Marcus had violated noise ordinances and community standards through excessive use of power tools during restricted hours. The notice included a fine of $500 and threatened additional penalties if the violations continued, with language clearly designed to escalate the conflict and force Marcus to either comply with the board's demands or engage in expensive and time-consuming legal proceedings. Daniels delivered the notice with an air of nervous officiousness, clearly uncomfortable with his role, but unwilling or unable to refuse the board's instructions, and he departed quickly after handing over the paperwork as if he wanted to minimize his exposure to any potential consequences of the board's actions. Marcus photographed the notice and immediately forwarded copies to Sandra Williams and Detective Martinez, documenting the board's continued harassment even after he had made clear that he was a federal law enforcement officer and that their actions were potentially criminal. The timing of the notice was particularly significant because it came just days after his organizing meeting with other homeowners, suggesting that the board either had informants within the community who were reporting on resistance activities or that they were simply panicking and lashing out at anyone they perceived as a threat to their control. Either way, the notice represented additional evidence of the board's consciousness of guilt and their willingness to abuse their authority to protect their fraudulent scheme, and it would strengthen both the civil harassment claims and the criminal case that was being built against them. Sandra called Marcus within an hour of receiving the notice to inform him that she was accelerating their timeline for filing the lawsuit, believing that the board's escalating harassment created an urgency that justified immediate legal action to protect her clients from further abuse. She had already drafted most of the necessary pleadings and could file them by the end of the week, seeking both monetary damages for the harassment and injunctive relief that would prohibit the board from continuing their targeting of homeowners who questioned their authority. Sandra also mentioned that she had been contacted by Carol Anderson, the HOA administrative assistant, who had reached out through a mutual acquaintance after hearing that there was going to be legal action against the board, and who wanted to discuss what she knew about the financial irregularities in exchange for protection from retaliation and potential legal liability. The prospect of Carol Anderson's cooperation represented a potential breakthrough in the investigation, as someone with direct access to the HOA's financial records and internal communications could provide crucial evidence about how the fraud scheme operated and who was involved in authorizing and concealing the fraudulent payments. Marcus suggested that Sandra arrange a meeting with Carol as soon as possible, preferably with Detective Martinez present, so that any statements could be properly documented for potential use in criminal proceedings, and so that Carol could be informed about witness protection options and immunity agreements that might be available if she provided substantial assistance to the investigation. Sandra agreed and promised to coordinate with Martinez's office to schedule a formal interview within the next few days, emphasizing to Carol that her cooperation needed to be complete and truthful if she wanted to avoid being charged as an accessory to the fraud. Meanwhile, word of the developing conflict between Marcus and the HOA board was beginning to spread through the neighborhood despite efforts to keep the organizing activities discreet, with the community dividing into factions that either supported the board's authority or questioned their handling of finances and enforcement. Marcus received several supportive messages from neighbors, expressing appreciation that someone was finally standing up to Gerald and Patricia's heavy-handed leadership, while others sent concerned notes, warning that challenging the board would only create problems and disrupt the neighborhood's harmony. A few homeowners who were apparently close to the board sent hostile messages accusing Marcus of being a troublemaker who wanted to undermine legitimate governance, suggesting that if he did not like the rules, he should move elsewhere rather than causing problems for everyone else. Marcus responded politely to the supportive messages and ignored the hostile ones, recognizing that community opinion would ultimately be shaped by evidence rather than by individual persuasion efforts. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and Marcus coordinated with David, Jennifer, Maria, and Tom to attend together as a group, planning to sit together in the front row and present a united front that would make it clear to the board that they were facing organized resistance rather than isolated complaints. Sandra advised them to remain calm and professional during the meeting, regardless of how the board reacted to their presence or their questions, to document everything with recordings and notes, and to focus on asking specific questions about financial transparency and contractor relationships, rather than making direct accusations that might give the board grounds to claim harassment or disruption. The goal was to create a public record of the board's defensiveness and evasiveness that would support their legal claims, while also educating other homeowners about the issues at stake and potentially recruiting additional allies for the fight ahead. Marcus spent the days leading up to the meeting, reviewing his evidence and preparing specific questions that would be difficult for the board to evade without revealing their guilt or appearing unreasonable to neutral observers. He planned to ask for copies of all invoices and contracts with Willow Creek Property Services, to request clarification about the selection process for contractors and whether competitive bids had been obtained for major projects, and to inquire about the board's policy for financial audits and transparency in reporting expenditures to homeowners. These questions were carefully crafted to appear reasonable and consistent with normal homeowner oversight, while actually probing the exact areas where the fraud was most extensive, creating a situation where the board would either have to provide information that would expose their crimes or refuse in ways that would appear suspicious and unjustified. On the evening of the board meeting, Marcus arrived at the community center where the HOA held its monthly gatherings to find a larger than usual crowd assembled, with nearly 50 homeowners present compared to the typical attendance of a dozen or fewer residents. The increased turnout suggested that news of the conflict had spread widely, and that many people were curious about what would happen when Marcus and his group confronted the board, creating an audience that would witness whatever transpired and form their own opinions about who was acting reasonably and who was being defensive or evasive. Gerald and Patricia were already seated at the front table with the other board members, their expressions revealing barely concealed hostility as they watched Marcus and his allies take seats in the front row, and Officer Daniels stood awkwardly near the door, as if providing security despite having no actual authority or training for such a role. Gerald called the meeting to order with his usual self-important manner, running through routine business items at an accelerated pace, as if hoping to limit the time available for questions or discussion from the audience. When the meeting reached the section for homeowner comments and questions, Marcus raised his hand to be recognized, noting the way Gerald's face tightened and Patricia's hand moved to grip her pen as if preparing to take aggressive notes. Gerald acknowledged Marcus with obvious reluctance, his voice carrying an edge of preemptive defensiveness as he granted permission to speak, while simultaneously warning that comments needed to remain respectful and relevant to legitimate HOA business. Marcus stood and introduced himself calmly, mentioning his address and his status as a homeowner in good standing, before launching into his first question about the community's financial transparency and audit procedures, asking when the last independent audit had been conducted and whether the results were available for homeowner review. The question hung in the air for a moment as Gerald and Patricia exchanged quick glances that betrayed their discomfort, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the board's response. Gerald cleared his throat and began to answer with vague generalities about the board's fiscal responsibility and proper management of community funds, but he conspicuously avoided providing any specific information about audits or making any commitment to transparency. Marcus listened politely and then followed up with a more pointed question about Willow Creek Property Services, asking how that contractor had been selected and whether their work had been verified before payments were authorized, noting that he had heard concerns from neighbors about work that had supposedly been completed but that no one could actually recall seeing performed. This second question caused visible reactions from both Gerald and Patricia, with Gerald's face flushing red and Patricia actually standing up from her seat as if preparing to physically respond to the challenge, and the tension in the room became palpable as everyone present recognized that something significant was happening beyond normal HOA business. What happened next would determine whether the board would attempt to brazen through the accusations or whether they would make mistakes that would accelerate their downfall. And Marcus watched carefully as Gerald struggled to formulate a response that would satisfy the audience without admitting anything that could be used against him later. The confrontation was finally becoming public, and the eventual outcome would reshape the entire neighborhood's governance and potentially send corrupt board members to prison. But for now, the battle was just beginning, and Marcus was prepared to see it through to whatever conclusion justice required.